Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. I'm also someone who, according to 23andMe, is 43.7% Irish and British. Those of you who've been listening to the Fox Page for a long time know that I'm mildly obsessed. I mean, you could strike the mildly. I'm pretty much like full-fledged obsessed with Irish literature. Really, it started with Anne Enright and The Gathering a million years ago, but was very much intensified by Anna Burns's incredible novel Milkman. I've since really immersed myself. If you go to the Fox Page YouTube channel, there's a whole playlist that is all Irish literature. So when I saw this volume, I Could Read the Sky, by Timothy O'Grady and Steve Pyke, it was on the front table of one of my local bookstores. As soon as I realized that we were talking about Ireland, I dove right in. And I tell you, this is one of those books that has a unique reading experience that I really could not wait to discuss with all of you. So the main thing that makes this such a unique reading experience is the fact that the incredible text written by Timothy O'Grady is incredibly well complemented by these gorgeous photographs by Steve Pyke. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today, and honestly, I can tell you from the top that this book would not have worked if the prose were not so incredibly gorgeous and haunting. But we're going to talk a lot at the beginning about these photographs and all the ways in which they make this an incredible reading experience, after which we're going to dive into a somewhat more typical lecture and really take a close look at why this is such an incredible book. And honestly, before we dive into the agenda, I'd like to start with the controlling idea of this entire lecture, which is the controlling idea, in fact, of the book, which is that this is an incredible evocation of home. This is the experience of someone who has emigrated from Ireland to England. And I found it absolutely genius, the way that through prose and through images, this narrator is trying, and I think succeeding, to really allow himself to recapture what his homeland was all about. I found this incredibly moving at a time in this world where we are thinking a lot about immigration and emigration, and I just was absolutely blown away and want to not lose track of the fact that this book is deeply, deeply sad and deeply haunting, and that in the hands of Timothy O'Grady and Steve Pyke, this book is doing exactly what it should be in the most effective way, because really the only way that we have to sort of regain and recapture any experience of any country is through words, through language, and through images. So we're going to dive deep into the main project of this book, which is essentially a recapturing of Ireland. For those of you who like an agenda, first we're going to talk very briefly about the biographies of Timothy O'Grady and Steve Pyke. We're then going to talk about the publication history of this book. I can tell you right now, it was published in 1997 and it was recently republished in 2023. And as I just mentioned, I think in many ways it is a very timely book and one that I found just incredibly poignant given the point in time where we are here in early February of 2025. We're then going to dive into the book. We're going to look at the title, the preface, the epigraphs, and the poem, and then we're going to take a look at the first paragraph. Then we're going to move on to talk about the experience of the photographs. This was honestly my favorite part of the lecture to prepare. Timothy O'Grady talks very clearly about what the photographs are meant to do and essentially says they are not meant to illustrate what he is talking about in the novel. If you notice, I just hesitated saying novel, and earlier I hesitated saying book. So this is a book. It doesn't say a novel on the front. It doesn't say a novel in the frontispiece. It was very hard for me. I got to like page 45 and I was like, wait, like once I was really invested, I was like, is this a true story? Because if this is like one person's story, I might just like collapse under the weight of this sad, sad story. And I was actually so relieved to understand that this is, in fact, a novel. It is a piece of literature that in many ways comes from true stories of true people, but it is an amalgam of the stories of many, many Irish emigres. And honestly, it was so haunting and captivating and felt so deep and real to me that I was so relieved. I mean, it's a stupid thing because essentially instead of telling the story of one single person, it's actually the story of many, many, many hundreds and thousands of people who have left Ireland. So on some level, I should have been more haunted. But for some reason, the fact that it was a novel, that it was made up and not true, was such a gigantic relief for me. But it is a book where you kind of are wondering the whole time, like, is this a novel? Is this a memoir? It reads very much like a memoir. And certainly the presence of the photographs makes it feel more quote unquote real, because we have these images of real places and real people. So before we even dive in, we have to sort of answer this question. I mean, hopefully now I'll remember to say novel as we are moving through. But it is so interesting to me the ways in which it does not feel like fiction. And the photos have everything to do with that. It is absolutely striking. We're going to look at a couple of instances where the photographs just absolutely lift the prose off the page in a way that is unusual and incredibly affecting. We're then going to talk about the structure pretty briefly and the narrative stance. Then we're going to take a look at the prose. We're going to look at the influence of Irish language. We're going to look at the fragments. It's a book that is built on all sorts of fragments and also an accumulation of fragments. It's this absolutely beautiful thing that he does that feels quite lyrical when you really dig into it, where we have this kind of loading up, this whole series of fragments that are absolutely beautiful and that evoke Ireland in this incredible way. Because, of course, if you are someone who is much, much older toward the end of his life and you are looking back at your childhood in Ireland, everything would come back to you in fragments. So it's a really beautiful way. And we're going to dive into how these fragments work so well in the prose. We're then going to talk about, just very briefly, I'm going to list these sort of, like, the word that came to mind was themes, and they're really not themes. I came up with the idea of like realities or emphases. There are these things that Timothy O'Grady is emphasizing. There are these strands that he is incorporating all through the novel, and they really are incredibly important, and I don't have time. And we don't have time and energy to really dive into all of them. But I really want to just sort of list these things that seem in many ways like the kind of warp and weft of the fabric of this novel. At the very end, we're just going to talk about this one brief paragraph where a ghost-like figure is talking about books and the function of books and the function of an author. And this is a book in many ways that really appeals to someone who is very much a wordsmith, and yet it is not a book that is sort of steeped in books. It is not literary. This is not a group of people who are enormous readers. It's a book that in many ways is very grounded in real life. It's grounded in work. It's grounded in family. It's grounded in the body. It's grounded in suffering. It's grounded in the weather. It is not, in fact, grounded in literature. But there is one point where he talks about books in a way that was incredibly informative when you look at the entire endeavor. Okay, we're diving into our super quick biographies. Timothy O'Grady was born in 1951 in Chicago, actually, with the name Timothy O'Grady. It doesn't leave a lot of doubt that he does, in fact, come from some sort of Irish family. But it is interesting that he is an American citizen. He lived in Ireland, in London, and in Spain. Those are the three things that were listed. He does not have a Wikipedia page, but these were things that were listed in some sort of author bio on some sort of publishing house website. He is someone who obviously is very interested in the idea of the Irish immigrant. And in some ways, I think you could argue that maybe the story would have been best told by someone who, and for all I know, he did spend many of his formative tiny child years in Ireland. But on some level, it's... I do kind of subscribe to that idea that someone who is coming in from the outside, and certainly someone who is literary and has a way with words, might be able to articulate some things. And also, he talks in the end at the acknowledgments about all of the people who shared their stories with him. He seems like someone who is an incredibly good listener, because you do very quickly, there's one character, there's one narrator, but you get the sense that this really is an amalgam of stories. And Timothy O'Grady apparently is the perfect person to articulate them. Steve Pyke was born in 1957. He's 68 years old. I can't do the math on how old Timothy O'Grady is. He's got to be, 70-something, 74? Oh, gosh, born in 1951. Steve Pyke is 68 years old, born in 1957 in Britain. We have a little bit more about him. He is a very well-established photographer. He has things in the New York Public Library, kind of more importantly in the National Portrait Gallery in London. And I think I saw somewhere maybe even the Met, there was some, that I didn't go back and look for that again, but one of these very big, important American museums, also the Victoria and Albert. He's a very, very well-established person. He's very well known for his portraits, which comes in very handy here. There's beautiful landscape work, much like the picture on the front of the book, but really the portraits of the people, these sort of images of these haunting faces, are an incredibly good way for us to get a sense of the stories of this myriad of people who are really, brought to life throughout the novel. Importantly, he dropped out of high school when he was 16 years old. He worked in a textile factory. He went to London when he was 21, was involved in the music scene there. He took some sort of motorcycle ride across the United States, and that's kind of apparently like with an Instamatic camera or something. And that was, I guess, where, his photography really came to the fore. He's now a New Yorker staff photographer, and he lives in New Orleans, of all places. I don't know why that seemed odd to me. It just, wow. I mean, it seems like a bit of a cultural shift, but good for Steve Pyke. Okay, now that we've done the bios, we're going to dive on in. The first thing I want to look at is the cover art. Do I love it? I don't really love it. I kind of wanted it to be green. I wasn't sure about the blueness. This is a book, actually, for those of you on the YouTube, you can see that I'm wearing what is, in fact, an Aran sweater from the Aran Islands. It's like your Irish kind of fisherman's knit. I was in thinking that I would wear like this green sweater that I have that's very vibrant, that makes me think of Ireland. This is a book, though, that is not really highlighting the color green. This is one where grays and blacks and whites are really the foremost color. So in some ways it seemed more appropriate to go for this sweater. I was very tempted to wear my new masterpiece, which turns out is a Fair Isle sweater. I did a little research for any of you fiber artists out there, and maybe everyone already knows this, but the typical sort of Irish, fisherman's knit sweater comes from the Aran Islands, A-R-A-N, Aran. The Fair Isle sweater is Scottish. This is an example of a Fair Isle sweater. It comes off of Fair Isle. Literally, it's called Fair Isle, which is part of the Shetland archipelago. I saw that when I was looking this up this morning, and the minute that I saw the Fair Isle as part of the Shetland archipelago, I immediately pictured all of these tiny islands with lots of sheep because of all the Fair Isle beautiful yarn that would be spun, but then also tiny horses everywhere. So this apparently is an Aran sweater, not to be confused with the Fair Isles. I like the idea that right on the front here, we have Timothy O'Grady and Steve Pyke are sharing, the sort of the billing here. I like that Timothy O'Grady is first. I said it before, I just don't think this book could survive. It would not be as incredible as it is if it were not such amazing prose. I think it probably can stand on its own without the photographs, but I'm not sure that the photographs would be quite as interesting in this form, in a book form, if it were not, in fact, for Timothy O'Grady's incredible prose. But I want to take a look at the idea of this title. I loved the title. Right away, it speaks to some idea of the sort of lyrical. I mean, it's a very, it sounds like something that might have been pulled from a poem. And in fact, it's not pulled from a poem, it's pulled from an incredible paragraph, which we are about to get to. But before we look at where we find it in the text, I want to just look at the actual title itself. So it begins with this I, with the first person. We have this kind of phantom being who is in fact the narrator who is going to tell this story. But this I is very central. It's the first word that we are seeing when we even pick up the book. So you know that there is someone at the center. But what's interesting is there isn't actually one person at the center. There is a narrator who is embodying thousands and thousands of people and their various stories. But I loved the idea of the intimacy with this first person right at the beginning of the title. The idea also of I could read the sky, so I could, that's the imperfect mood, and it really, what it's talking about is something that you used to do habitually in the past. So it's not I read the sky, it's I could read the sky. It's something that was done over a long period of time, many, many number of times. Which is such a beautiful way to evoke the idea that this is going to be a book that is talking about things that were habitual in the past, things that happened again and again and again, not a single event, but instead, an entire youth or an entire existence in a certain place. Then the idea of reading. So I mentioned before that this is not a super readerly book. And I love the fact that what this narrator, what this first person is reading here is the sky. So, most of the time when you think about reading, you're thinking about reading words. But I'll say it again, this is a book that is very concerned with the body and with suffering and with nature and with vastness and with weather and with work. It is not concerned so much with language. There's not a ton of dialogue in the book. I mean, it's very concerned with the Irish language in some very subtle ways. But the idea of reading the sky and the importance of seeing certain weather coming and the importance of being highly aware of your surroundings really speaks to this idea of being able to kind of evoke Ireland because of the idea of evoking a particular sky. The other thing, though, that was so important, there's a beautiful passage in the book later where once our narrator has emigrated, there's a whole part about the constellations and stars. And so there's this beautiful idea there of reading the sky, of reading all of these constellations, and the idea that, they're in England, so they're not particularly far from Ireland, that you would be looking at all the same stars. And on some level, everyone on Earth is looking at the same stars, sort of in totality. I think that's true. I don't know. Maybe people in Australia are always seeing different stars. I am not an astrologist. Oh my God, wait, I'm also not an astronomer. That's crazy. But what I will say here is the idea of reading the sky is both particular to Ireland in this case. This narrator saying, I could read the sky in the sense that he knew weather was coming, or what you could do on a given day given the weather, but also this idea of the stars, and that every time he looked to the sky, certainly at night, he would see the same thing. So no matter where he was, it's the same sky. It's just beautiful. It's so beautiful, in fact, that I want to take a look at where it pops up in the text. Those of you who've listened to the Fox page for a long time know that my best tip for reading better is to simply pay more attention. And one thing you can really pay attention to is the title. You should read it as if it were the first line of the book. But I also always get like a little frisson. It's always very exciting for me when I run across a title, especially if it's verbatim, in the course of a text. So here we have on page 53. It's so beautiful. This is a chapter that is made up of one short sort of fragmentary sentence and then one paragraph. It's such a beautiful standalone chapter. It's very short, and I'm going to read it to you. Chapter 9, this is on page 53. What I could do. I could mend nets, thatch a roof, build stairs, make a basket from reeds, splint the leg of a cow, cut turf, build a wall, go 3 rounds with Joe in the ring Da put up in the barn. I could dance sets, read the sky, make a barrel for mackerel, mend roads, make a boat, stuff a saddle. I might actually stop there because it's beautiful and it goes on and on like that. This is an example of both fragments and the accumulation of them and how beautifully evocative both of those things are. But I think this gives you a good sense of how reading the sky, when we come across it here on page 53, becomes one of many, many things that he could do. What I could do, I could read the sky. I was so just kind of shook by all of the things that this person is capable of doing. That seems like such a wide variety of things to be able to do. And this is a relatively young person. This is someone who leaves Ireland at a relatively young age. So you imagine someone at a young person being able to do all of these skills that seem like very, very useful to me. A little further down, also, though, in a very germane say, it says, read the wind. So the idea of reading the sky and reading the wind, there also is a very important, I'm just scanning through here, and one of the things is make a coffin, which is both which is sort of a foreshadowing, and also is just a beautiful and very sad and elegiac thing to insert in a book about emigration. But so this idea of reading the sky and reading the wind and all of these things that this person is able to do also reinforces the idea that this is a book where there's just crushing poverty. And that comes in large part because there isn't enough work. But it is a book that is incredibly concerned with the idea of work, both the lack thereof and with all of the different kinds of work and all of the different assumed names that people would take on in order to be these seasonal workers who would travel all over England where there was more opportunity. So all of these useful feats that this person can perform are sort of presaged in some way by this beautiful title at the beginning. We also then have a couple of instances of this person, this narrator, reading the sky. On page 71, when he is first arriving in Liverpool, he says, "The sky looks like pork gone off," which is it's just so sad and evocative. And I mean, that's a very good simile right there, people. You know that I am very picky when it comes to figurative language, certainly metaphor and simile, and this is a very good one. Even if you've never seen pork that's like rotting, you can imagine exactly what that would look like. At least I can. We do a lot of pork chops around here. But the grayness that pervades the novel is really, really tangible here with the simile. And it's very important that we have the idea of reading the sky and that the different descriptions of the sky throughout are backing that up and adding nuance to whatever's happening. We also, on page 86, there's lots of figurative language with the sky here. There's this beautiful fragment that says, "The sky growling like a dog watching something he doesn't like. again, I mean, it's the idea of the sky making noises. I mean, that kind of thundering, far off thundering that you might hear as if it were a dog's growl. We have another example on page 119. Outside, the sky is low and very dark, and the wind is flattening the grass and the smoke as it comes out of the chimney. So this is a very sad part of the book, and the sky being very low and dark, and certainly the wind flattening things, the sort of the violence and just the predominance, the power of nature in this place is very clear. It's also so beautiful because of all the black and white photographs. We really get the sense of grayness throughout the entire book, both in the prose and in the photographs. So I love this idea of being able to read this sky, which, famously in Ireland would often be gray. We're going to move very quickly through all the stuff that comes before this beautiful first paragraph. There's an introduction by John Berger. I didn't really love it. I wanted to love it because it seems like a very collaborative book, so it seems like they would have a good person to write the preface. It was really basically about, this book was so painful for me to read. Pretend I'm John Berger. This book was so painful for me to read that I cannot open it again. So go ahead, reader, you go ahead and immerse yourself in this deep, deep sadness, but I'm gonna hang back. So I found that, fair warning, and I appreciated it. I also did find myself reading this book very quickly, in part because the photographs allow you to do that. You move through it very quickly. But I also kind of wanted to move through it. It's very sad. It's a very haunting book in many ways, but it's that kind of haunting and that kind of sadness that is poignant and important and certainly makes you appreciate lots of things about your own life, and was really, really important for me in terms of understanding the idea of immigration that is driven by poverty. I mean, it just was so stark to me, the poverty in this book and the way that poverty is driving patterns of emigration. I mean, it seems so obvious. And actually, recently I saw the movie version of Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. You absolutely must read that book if you have not read it already. It's almost a novella. Claire Keegan is an absolute genius. There are Foxed Page lectures on those books. And I was very excited to watch the movie version of Small Things Like These because Cillian Murphy is the main character in it. Did it do justice to the novel? I'm not really sure, but I really liked the movie, certainly. And one thing that it really brought to the fore for me was the poverty. I mean, the poverty is obviously all throughout the novella, but it really, really came to the fore when you have all the visuals of how difficult life was. And this is not that long ago. This is the 80s, 1980s in Ireland. So I really appreciated the ways that this book really delved into the idea of this crushing poverty that did lead to a lot of emigration. So John Berger had his somewhat scary warning, essentially, to the reader. Then we have the two quick epigraphs. I whispered, memory hurts wherever you touch it. That was by George Seferis. And then, in remembrance is the secret of redemption. Holocaust Memorial, San Francisco. So part of me was like, wow, the Holocaust Memorial is that's a big, bold thing to put at the beginning of your book, because essentially you are making some comparison with the Holocaust. But the message here is really important. This idea of remembrance, the book is entirely made up of remembering. That is the preoccupation, both in the photographs and in the text. But the idea of it leading to redemption. So redemption in many ways, if you think about it in terms of religious terms, being redeemed is being sort of saved. And obviously this is a book that has to do in many ways with Catholicism. There's not a lot of preoccupation with religion, but there's certainly lots and lots of rosaries, and there's lots of guilt, and there's lots of shame, all of which I associate with Catholicism. But the idea of redemption also means regaining something. If you can redeem something, you get to have it. So this idea of redemption, both as being a sort of absolution, but also like a taking back, like a regaining of something. I just thought this epigraph was so well placed. In remembrance is the secret of redemption. Then we have this poem by Peter Woods, which we're not gonna dive into, but it repeats the word exile over and over and over. Exile is not a word; it is a sound. And then he goes on, and it's a very beautiful poem. It's one that spoke to me pretty clearly. That's my kind of poetry. I like poetry that's not too opaque, that's not too just like where you're scratching your head and you're like, I don't think I understand this. This was something that was very evocative, and I liked the way that this poem, in many ways, kind of mimicked what we have in the book, which is all of these fragments all woven together in a beautiful structure that are talking about exile and talking about the difficulty of being away from your homeland. It's crucial to note that we begin then with an image. If you're on the YouTube, you can see this beautiful image here. In each of the photographs in this book, you could spend, an hour simply talking about one of them. This, though, deserves a bit of mention. What we have here is a padlock, some sort of a lock. It's very beautiful. It looks very, very old, but it's not locking anything. It's hanging on a nail on a very worn board. So you have this idea of things being locked, but also of nothing being there. So in some ways, it's this idea of things being unlocked, things being free, but also the idea of the fact that the things that are locked are no longer there. In many ways, this is a book about not being able to go back and not being able to sort of redeem your childhood or redeem family members who you have literally lost track of. So it's a beautiful way to open this with this idea of the lock. I have to admit that the second image that we have here, again, those of you on the YouTube can see it. It's a picture of a man's hands. I'm assuming it's a man, might be a woman, and the fingernails are I don't know. They're very sort of damaged, and it's a very painful thing to look at, actually, to such an extent that as I was reading the first page, I had to put my hand over the top of that image. It also, it's a little distorted. They're kind of, the fingers are woven together and they're on a very black ground. So it is in fact a difficult image to look at. But I think on some level, it's a real success if an image is so striking that someone has to cover it because it is so moving and so evocative here of pain, essentially, and discomfort. I think that's the sign of a good image. And it's a very good one in many ways to kick us off. So on page 3, though, we have these beautiful opening paragraphs. This room is dark as it ever gets, the hour before the dawn in winter. I have sounds and pictures, but they flit and crash before I can get them. The bedclothes are damp, the ache in my neck is bad. I hold on to myself for anchorage. So notably, it's such a beautiful paragraph. What this is doing right at the beginning here, this is in present tense. He's saying this room is dark. And he's saying, I have sounds. So this is a first-person narrator. We have one person. He is in a room. He is in its sort of darkest before the dawn kind of moment. It's winter time. So we have this very kind of elegiac mood that this one person is describing. And that's important because he's holding on to himself for anchorage. Very importantly, that is the last word in the first paragraph. Another little tip from the Fox page. Any word that comes at the end, even of a sentence, but certainly a paragraph or a chapter, you should take a close look at that because there is an extra emphasis on it, partly because all of our energy in the sentence or the chapter or the paragraph is moving toward this word, but also because it is a word that sort of lingers, even, just for a couple of, split seconds, if it's the end of a sentence. But here, the idea of holding on to myself for anchorage is important there because this person in this room, in this bed, is also the anchor for the reader. This is someone who it is the person who is describing the story. It is the person whose childhood we are going to hear about, whose family we're going to get to know, whose wife we're going to get to know. And it's very kind of Timothy O'Grady, actually, to make this so clear. This is a book that is very clear in many ways, although later we're going to talk about some structural things he does that are really sophisticated and really effective. But it's also very straightforward. We feel very anchored in the sense that we know this is a first-person narration. There's some guy, he's lying in bed, it's dark, it's wintertime, and he's telling us about his childhood. It's also important that the word is anchorage. Ireland it's a little island, and it's surrounded obviously by the sea, and there are many, many beautiful photographs of waves just crashing. And there's a lot of description of water and of being on boats. I mean, not a lot, but there is some. And it's very important because, of course, moving across that body of water is, in fact, the process of emigration in this book. So the idea of anchorage is also important, given the fact that we are talking about the island of Ireland. Then, very kind of neatly and in a very straightforward manner, we move from this first-person narrator who's lying in the bed to this memory that he is having. Again, this is page 3. Something stirs then, a little wind. It's very gentle, a lark's breath. But the thickened air drifts across to clear, and I see it. The house, set just nicely into the side of a green hill. The fuchsia bending around the window is red, and the thatch so bright you'd think there was a fire in it. I am up on my brother Joe's back painting the north door with my hands. We have the paint, but we haven't the brush. So this is so beautiful in so many ways, and we're going to unpack it a little. I just was talking about how there isn't much green in this book, and then of course we have green right at the beginning. We also have this incredible fuchsia. It's a very colorful image that he is beginning with, and that in fact makes it all the more, sort of difficult and painful that a lot of the rest of the book is not very colorful. Right now I'm thinking of the fact, I'm not going to ruin any of this because I really don't. This is not something that's going to have spoilers. This is a lecture that would be very appropriate to listen to before you were going to listen. But there are a pair of red shoes that come later in the book that are very important. There's a dress that has a pattern on it that is also important and that is colorful. So there are very few things that are colorful as we move down. There's some descriptions of doors. At one point, this door is blue instead of green. So you have this idea of color as being very important, but also being relatively scarce. It's also crucial here. We don't know who this family is. We don't know really very much at all at this point about our narrator, but we do know that he has an older brother. And that older brother becomes very important. I started piecing together, not a family tree exactly, but a list of all of the children. There are many of them. I think there are like 7 or 8 of them. And we learn their names slowly as we move through the novel. And as you might expect, a couple of them are more sort of central than others. At one point, relatively late, we realize that the older brother's name is Joe Brady. So then obviously everybody's name is Brady. We do not know the name of the narrator. And that is so beautiful. I love it when we have an unnamed narrator, because what that does for the reader is it allows you to imagine this person as many, many people. If suddenly we realize that his name was Patrick or Owen, well, I don't know, maybe that would be fine. But I love the idea of an unnamed narrator, also because we know from the acknowledgments and we know just from I think you would gather this even if you hadn't read the acknowledgments. This is an amalgam of many, many people's stories. So in some way, it's a very nice, it sort of gives justice to the fact that many people have the same experience. It's not the experience of one named person. I did like when we found out that the last name was Brady, though, for many reasons. One of them is that Brady, of course, is bringing up the idea of braiding. So you have this idea of many stories all braided together in this beautiful way, which is what the novel is doing. I also liked the idea that our author's name is Timothy O'Grady. And obviously Grady and Brady are not the exact same thing, but they're close. But you have Brady, and then you have O'Grady. And of course, in Irish, O'Grady means like of Grady. But I love the way that the last name, that Timothy's last name speaks to like a lineage, and it speaks to a certain place. And that Brady is very close to it, but the last name is not Grady, which I think would have been a little bit too on the nose. We also get a sense right from the beginning of the playfulness of this. We have a tactile sense. This is a child who's painting a door with his hands. This idea of having the paint but not the brush speaks to a lack. On some level, you can read that as speaking to poverty, that they couldn't afford to have a brush for this occasion. But it also speaks to the idea of work. These are children who are used to working from the time they are very young. And that idea of work is absolutely ingrained through the entire novel. Now that we have taken a look at the beginning, we're going to go on to talk about one of the most remarkable aspects of the book, which is the presence of all of these photographs. Significantly, we have 2 images before we even dive into the text, and the images are really, I mean, I wonder if you counted page for page. Sometimes, you'd have 3 or 4 photographs, like a full bleed, 2 pages together. You'd have several of those in a row between short paragraphs. So it is a book that is very image heavy, and I think that's incredibly effective. I was so happy I came across this quotation by Timothy O'Grady talking about the photographs in the book. He says this: "I could read the sky as a novel which tells its story through words and photographs. The story is that of an Irish emigrant struggling to possess his life in acts of memory. He is old, he is alone, he is lying in bed at night in the darkness, remembering a life of dislocation, of loss, of descent into madness, and of redemption through music and through the love of a woman. Some of the time he is remembering on prose, and some of the time in pictures." I think that's a typo. I think they mean some of the time he is remembering in prose, and some of the time in pictures. Neither is meant to illustrate the other. They are distinct acts of memory in their own right. The act of remembering itself becomes a way of completing his life. It's so beautiful. And I love the idea. I mean, he's really laying it out here. These are not meant to illustrate. And I think as an astute reader, you know that from the beginning. I have a sense that Steve Pyke has just like zillions and zillions of these amazing photographs. I just think that would have been so fun to go through and find the ones that would be perfect for this novel. And you do get the sense that they're not meant to illustrate, but they do such beautiful things throughout. One quick note on the fact that they're black and white. I would argue that, in fact, a lot of them are gray. There are lots of grays. And I think if they were full color, you would have a very different idea of them. Partially, black and white seems more dramatic. It also seems older in many ways. But there is also a sense of not quite being able to sort of resurrect the thing, which is also very appropriate because obviously an image is not an actual resurrection of a person or a place. But there are a few things that were so interesting, and I want to take a look at them. One is that throughout the entire book, on pages 20, 24, 75, 140, and 155, we have the presence of someone called Baby. So very early on in the novel, we have our narrator with his father, and someone walks by named Baby, and Baby is pushing a pram that is empty. And so you get the sense that Baby is in fact a grown woman. It's really interesting that they call her Baby. It's Baby with a capital B, that is her name. And the father right from the start says this beautiful thing about the fact that she is mad. This is someone who is not necessarily mentally well, but also this is someone who we need to take care of. The idea at the beginning, I'm not going to read them all because it would take too long, is that if the father says to the son, if you see her, sort of you should help her on her way home. And later our narrator has a very respectful conversation with her. And it's very important here that we have the idea of a woman who is in fact a baby. So you have this idea, I mean, she's not a baby, but like they're calling her Baby. You have this idea that every single person is both, someone who is young and also someone who will be old, or if they're old, they at one point were a baby. But very importantly, this is a woman who is sort of ceaselessly pushing this empty pram. And you could speak to the fact that maybe she is an Irish woman who never had children, which would have been very difficult given the emphasis on having a lot of children in the Irish Catholic culture. But also you have the sense of this is a woman who is pushing a pram that is empty, because, in fact, her children have left. There is an absolutely gut-wrenching scene toward the beginning of this book about one of the sons leaving the mother. And there really is every chance that this mother of all of these children is not going to, in fact, see her children ever again. It's just absolutely heartbreaking. So this idea of pushing the empty pram speaks to this idea of the mothers who are left behind without their children. They stay in Ireland and the children are forced to leave because opportunity is so scarce and poverty is really harsh. But what happens is we have a photograph of a woman, a very distinct looking woman, who is standing next to a pram on a road in Ireland. It's an incredible photograph, but that is one of the places, it might be the only one. I mean, I read this book pretty thoroughly and pretty quickly, so I think my memory is pretty good. I think that might be the only time where we have an image that we associate with an actual name. So we have the idea of Baby as a photograph. We have an image of her that is illustrated. And then that person is brought up again and again throughout the novel. What that did for me is it made it feel more like a novel. Because we have a character who is, this sort of illustrated character who's coming up again and again. And you have to imagine that maybe wasn't exactly the experience of the narrator. This narrator maybe didn't run into this woman many, many times, or maybe he did. But you also have the sense of Baby, of this woman standing in for all of the women in Ireland who are maybe somewhat unwell, and certainly for all of them who are missing their children. We also have these beautiful moments. One of the sons is leaving Ireland, and his father is, I'm not going to spoil anything, but when this one man is leaving Ireland, he's a young man. And right before the paragraph that describes him leaving, you have an image of an older man who is walking away, kind of onto the moors. I don't know if they have moors. That's like a very Scottish kind of thing, I think. But he's walking away onto what looks like pretty inhospitable land. But all you see is the back of the father. So you have this idea of departure. You have this idea of a father as sort of not being able to handle what's happening. And in fact, the father does make himself scarce when the son finally is leaving. So you have this very painful idea about what it would be like to be a father whose son is leaving. And then we have the description of the son leaving. And then the next image is this beautiful, just an incredibly sort of joyful and poignant but bittersweet photograph of a young man holding a very young child. I think it's a little girl, and she's maybe 2. And he's holding her on a ship. and I think it's called The Irish Sea is the title. Very interestingly, most of the photographs are just a place. And I loved that. So it would just say like County Kerry, or it would say Dublin, and it would have the year, or it would say Inishmaan, which is an island. So it would give you the name of the place, but not most of the time there wouldn't be anything describing what was happening in the photo, and certainly not the name of any person, which really speaks to the idea of these people as all being very, sort of embedded in Ireland and in their kind of Irishness. But you have this image then of this father holding this very young child on what looks like a ferry. So you can imagine this young man departing, and the child in the photograph is looking very joyful, and the father looks very joyful. I mean, it's very much a father and child. And then you can sort of transpose onto it. You're almost made to transpose the idea, like kind of impose the idea of this young man who is on a ferry very much like that, but who is leaving the father behind. It's so well done. And I think you could go through and find all sorts of instances where the photographs are they're not illustrating things, but they're incredibly complementary in ways that really deepen the prose. The last thing I will say about the images is, again, Steve Pyke is known for his portraits. There are so many portraits of so many people, and so you're constantly reminded of all of the different people who are sharing this experience. So we do have our one narrator, but with all of these beautiful portraits, together, of course, with found objects and very domestic kind of found objects, or with landscapes. You have sort of a collage in many ways, but the number of portraits again and again and again, all of these different faces really speak to the fact that this is a very universal experience. I mean, not universal entirely, but it's a very shared experience, this idea of emigrating, this idea of exile, the idea of leaving your homeland is one that is shared. And even if you're the one who's left behind, if you're a mother or you're a sister, I think a lot of the young men are leaving because they are working outside the home. And actually lots and lots of women, of course, too, they're leaving and doing domestic work in other countries where there is pay and more opportunity. But all of the images together have this kind of multiplying effect that are it's so beautiful, because it really speaks to the pervasiveness of this experience that we are hearing from the mouth of the one narrator. I'm going to very briefly touch on the structure. I talked at the beginning about how we have this very straightforward first-person narrator who's lying in the bed, reminiscing. Reminiscing that's too light a word, but you know what I'm saying. He's having all of these memories of his childhood. But one of the really skillful things that Timothy O'Grady does is there's mention fairly early on of, I think it's something like Maggie liked that color pink. And just the past tense of that verb, that she liked that color pink, you're like, oh God, there's a woman named Maggie who bought him his pillowcase and is no longer with him. So you have this crazy tension where you're like, oh my God, wait, not only is he experiencing emigration and the loss of his homeland, but apparently there was also some woman who is no longer with him. And then, of course, you're thinking, how is he going to meet this woman? What is their relationship going to be like? Why is she no longer in his life? So there's this extra layer of tension and of intrigue and of sadness that really is introduced early on because just of a few things. I think we see a dress of hers that is hanging in the wardrobe. And again, it's the exact same thing. You have this idea of her presence and also her absence. There's also this incredible thing. At some point, someone goes into the hospital, and as the reader, you all of a sudden have this person in the hospital, and it's very unsettling. You don't know exactly what happened. You don't know why they're in the hospital. You don't know really what's happening at all. And it is only in the subsequent couple of chapters where it is pieced together as the reader, where you understand that he was in the hospital and you understand what point in the life this man was. And then only, a couple more chapters later, you realize what in fact happened, why he was in the hospital. Meanwhile, you're making all kinds of conjecture and you're trying to piece it together, which is so effective and interesting because it's really, it's as if we also, as the reader, are kind of coming out of some sort of anesthesia, some kind of fog, and having to piece together what happened. So there's structural elements here that are so well done. And it's very, on some level, again, it's very straightforward, but there are complexities here that are really, really well wrought and very effective. Now that we've covered a bit about the structure, I want to move on to talk about the prose. So one of the things that I loved about this is the presence of the Irish language. Those of you who've listened for a long time know that I spent a long, 6 or 9 months learning Irish on Duolingo, and I loved it. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of Irish literature that is written in Irish. So when I say Irish, I mean Gaelic, which, you can use those interchangeably. This is an ancient language that, the Irish people who were living on the island had their own language until the British came. So we have to give a little bit of a lesson in colonialism here. The British ruled Ireland for 700 years, so sometime in the 1200s, all the way through 1919, at which point the Irish Republic, except for Northern Ireland, became its own country. In many ways, that was not great for women. That's a whole thing that I went into recently. You would think, in this post-colonial age, in many ways, I was, I think very happily about the idea of Ireland having its own autonomy again. But as with all governments, there are some issues inherent in that change of government. But I really am interested in the idea of the Irish language, because that is a language that is so different. All you have to do is think of the name like Saoirse, and with all those crazy vowels and the S's that are pronounced like SH. It's a very, very different language. And I personally find it fascinating. And it is a language that's still spoken. I think probably lots of people were watching Say Nothing, which was a television series. It's also an amazing book, of course, about the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And in that book and in that movie, they are speaking a decent amount of Irish. There was a movement, even at the time of the, when Ireland became its own republic, this idea of like bringing back Irish and bringing back the language and all of the different cultural elements that the English rule had sort of squashed. And very interestingly, people like James Joyce was really not with it. That was sort of turn of the century, the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. There was this movement sort of wanting to bring back Irish culture and Irish language. And there were a lot of people in Ireland who really identified very strongly with the British people. And some of these, these are the big luminaries. James Joyce, certainly, he was very interested in writing in English and not, in fact, resurrecting Irish. So where we see it most, we see it a bit in the syntax, which we're going to get to, but also in some vocabulary. So I liked it when there were words that I did not understand. Egypt is one of them, E-E-J-I-T. That's actually a word that has made its way into American English. It's just like idiot. But when you first come across it, that it's kind of a put down, but it's not familiar, and I loved that. I also still don't really know what a gansey is, G-A-N-S-E-Y. It must be some sort of like sweater or jacket or something. You can push the sleeves of it up, so I thought it was a sweater, but then he also was talking about a jumper. So, you know enough about it to understand what it is, but I loved the fact that there is vocabulary that is distinctly Irish, that is not English, that as an American speaker, I don't understand. There's also at one point, there's a beautiful and heart-wrenching part about a man in England who is writing to his wife who is being unfaithful to him back in Ireland. And he talks about how it's difficult for her to be married to a spalpeen. And I didn't know what a spalpeen was. And it is an Irish word. In Irish, you spell it S-P-A-I-L-P-I-N with an accent over the second I. And in English, it's S-P-A-L-P-E-E-N. And it means a seasonal laborer. So that's been a word since 1767. This is not like an ancient Irish word, but it is certainly in Irish. And it is one that has endured, hundreds and hundreds of years. So I like when we see these kinds of Irish vocabulary words that are still in use. And briefly, we're going to take a look also at syntax. So you have vocabulary, but there's also the sort of way that the words are ordered or different uses of pronouns. They are very Irish and sort of not English. And a lot of this we see in dialogue because it's the way that people would speak with each other. The narrator himself there's some syntax that is distinctly Irish, but mostly we see it in the dialogue. So we have this on page 38. This is our narrator talking to his Uncle Roscoe. He's also talking about alcohol, which is pervasive throughout the novel. I take some, my second taste of it after Uncle Roscoe let me drink from his. Where are you for? I ask him. Up the town. So where are you for is not a typical English way to phrase that. I think it means like, where are you going? And then the answer is up the town, which I don't know if that means to town, but I love the fact that there are syntactical conventions that are alive and well that come from the Irish language. One other thing that happens all the time is he uses a contraction. This is something the narrator does, and it's very Irish. If you wanted to say he has, it would be contracted to he's. So he's a green gansey. I'm making that up, but like he's a he's a pint of lager, whatever you wanted to say there. But that idea of he's, in English, it would be he is, but here it means he has. So that contraction is something that is used often, and you get used to it very soon as the reader. But the first couple times you're like, whoa, this is slightly different. And I love the idea of underscoring the differences between the Irish and the English. We also have a lot of use of like your man so-and-so or your man, instead of like that guy so-and-so or just saying so-and-so, your man so-and-so or your woman so-and-so. I don't think it would say woman. I don't know what they would say. Maybe lady? I don't know. There's also a lot of yourself. So they use that pronoun instead of you, like what can I get yourself? That kind of a thing. So so some of these differences are very subtle, but I loved the way that the Irish comes through. The way we see it most apparently, though, of course, is in the place names. So you can imagine why place names would endure. I mean, if you have a place that's called something and everyone's calling it that, that would be slower to change than some of the linguistic things that are getting more use, when people are trying to be efficient about language. So when we have place names, they are so distinct. And here we also have that kind of accumulation of fragments that we have throughout the book that is so effective. So on page 21, I'm going to totally butcher these, but we have Ballinaclash, Ardnagia, and Killicolpi. On page 25, we have Caparoi, Elistrin, Mullagerrick, Ola, Dromdory, and Schwiel. I don't know if that's Schwiel or Swiel. It's S-U-I-L. Then we have Labashida, the bed of silk. So Labashida, I know Laba from my Irish learning days, it means bed. So Labashida is the hometown of this narrator, and Labashida means the bed of silk, or a silken bed. So we have all of these place names that sound so different from the place names, certainly that we have in America, but also in England. For counterpoint, we have this beautiful, quick couple of sentences on page 80 at one point when our narrator is in England. The click of the wheels on the tracks. It sounds different in England. Heavier, maybe. Warrington, Manchester, Stockport. So here we have, there are plenty of English names that I don't pronounce very easily, but these are very straightforward for an American. And they really speak to the difference between the Irish place names and these English ones. It's also so beautiful that we have this idea of the train tracks sounding differently. We have it in fragmentary form. And we also have the word England. So we have England together with Warrington, Manchester, and Stockport. So we have this real underscoring of how these place names have to do with England. We have the name of the country as well. I also really love these choices. Warrington would speak to war. So you have this idea of the colonial occupation of Ireland, this idea of war. Manchester, being a very industrial city, and Stockport having to be, having to do with stock, so like animal, like the idea of like beef or cattle, and also a port. So all of these are evocative of work and the work that someone might find in England. So the use of place names in both Ireland and England is so strong. The next thing I want to talk about in this gorgeous prose is the use of fragments. We've touched on it a couple of times already, so we're not going to dwell. But I do want to note just on this one beautiful use of fragments on page 132. Our narrator says, "The orchards were lovely to walk past on a Sunday, the scent of apples." It's so beautiful. So you have your independent clause, "The orchards were lovely to walk past on a Sunday," and then you have a comma and you have this fragment. It's really a dependent clause here. But here we just have this beautiful evocation. I'm going to read it again. "The orchards were lovely to walk past on a Sunday, the scent of apples." This also, of course, any of you readers out there, if you ever come across an apple, and certainly by a Sunday, you should think of Adam and Eve and the apple of life and the tree of knowledge and the idea of Eden. I don't think that Ireland here is coming across as super Edenic. I don't think we're looking at it as this, incredible place of, land of milk and honey and whatnot. But there is this idea, it's a very Catholic situation here, the idea of apples having to do with Sunday, having to do with Mass, having to do with Catholicism, having to do with original sin. So for a book that is very heavy, the idea, here he's talking about the scent of apples as being very light and very beautiful on a lovely day in an orchard. And this is the kind of fragment that I think is so evocative and so beautifully done. The other thing we've talked a little bit about is this accumulation. And I want to look at two other chunks of this just because they're so beautiful and because this is a very innovative way to speak to this idea of trying to resurrect something in memory, this idea of a bunch of things all in a row because you're attempting to search for something that you can't quite grasp. So this idea of naming a whole bunch of things, accumulating a whole bunch of things in an effort to describe something that is very difficult to apprehend in words. So we have that beautiful accumulation in the beginning of all the things he could do. One of them is he could read the wind, he could read the sky. And then about 75 pages later, we have him reminiscing about the things, he's still a young man at this point, but he's reminiscing about the things that he used to do along this road. What did I do along this road? I drove cattle. I hid from the master. I danced a hornpipe. I waited for Da to come home from Lincolnshire. One day I'll come back along it in a new suit filled with banknotes. So here we have kind of this beautiful echo of all of the things he could do when he was young. But here we have him really very forward-looking in the sense of leaving those things behind and what is going to come. Then on page 103, we have this really beautiful thing about halfway through the book. It's sometimes important to see what we have at the midpoint. This book is about 200 pages long. It's always interesting to me to see if there is something that's significant at the midpoint. So on page 103, and again, this is one of those beautiful chapters that is literally one paragraph long. Well, it's not one paragraph. It's just like the first it's just like the opening of the book. So we have the one line and then we have the more extended paragraph. And here we have the opposite of all the things he could do, and it reads this. What I couldn't do. Eat a meal lacking potatoes. Trust banks. Wear a watch. Ask a woman to go for a walk. Work with drains or with objects smaller than a nail. Drive a motor car. Eat tomatoes. Remember the routes of buses. Wear a collar in comfort. Win at cards. Acknowledge the queen. Abide loud voices. Perform the manners of greeting and leaving. Save money. Take pleasure in work carried out in a factory. Drink coffee. Look into a wound. Follow cricket. Understand the speech of a man from West Kerry. Wear shoes or boots made from rubber. Best PJ in an argument. Speak with men wearing collars. Stay afloat in water. Understand their jokes. Face the dentist. Kill a Sunday. Stop remembering. This is so beautiful. So here we have the structure of our person who is lying in bed and he's thinking back on all the things that he couldn't do. And these are things that are referring more to his life in England once he has emigrated. And every single one of those, trust a bank, save money, drink coffee, every single one of those little fragments opens up a whole entire world. In some ways, it's such an efficient way to really convey a lot of information, because every single one of those could have been an entire paragraph or even an entire chapter, but they're each so evocative and so well done and pushed together in that way. The part in the beginning about acknowledge the queen really speaks to, these very, very large issues of post-colonial life and allegiance and the way that you think about country. It's so well done, all of these fragments all accumulated together. And, this could be done in a very clumsy way and in a way that's much less revealing. And it's very much to Timothy O'Grady's credit that it works so beautifully in this prose. I'm going to discuss a couple of these emphases, these kind of themes, for lack of a better word, that I saw throughout that we're not going to dive too deeply into, but these are strains that were incredibly important and very well developed throughout the novel. And some of these we've already touched upon. One is poverty. I did a little research in 1973, which a lot of these images are from the 80s and 90s. But if Timothy O'Grady was born in 1951, he would have emigrated in the early 70s. And what we do know from the thing that I read online is that in 1973, Ireland was one of the EU's poorest countries. And, I think one of the things we all know about Ireland as an American is the potato famine. And even, in the United States, the number of immigrants from Ireland speaks of the poverty and the lack of opportunity there. So one of these strains is poverty, certainly. Another one is alcohol. We didn't dive too deeply into that today, but it is absolutely pervasive. And I think very, very well illustrated in very subtle but really powerful ways. It's kind of telling that the next thing on my list is this idea of shame. So there's a lot of shame. There's a lot of shame that's articulated, but also some shame that is not so much articulated. And it doesn't all have to do with alcohol, but it all sort of, both, but shame and alcohol seem sort of intertwined in many ways. The other thing that I would love to have dug into much more is this idea of music. Music is really, really important. There are instruments right at the beginning of the book and throughout the whole entire thing, our narrator is someone who is deeply invested in music. There's a lot of comment, a lot of really beautiful writing about the power of music to evoke things. And apparently I did not actually take the time to listen to this audiobook. I mean, honestly, I also was like, this is too sad. If I have like an incredible Irish accent and incredible Irish music, like the sadness might just be too much for me. But it would be really beautiful to listen to that because there is quite a bit of music, from what I understand, in the audio version. So it's very appropriate, although, of course, in the audio version, you're missing all of the photos. There is a film version of this, and I have not watched it. It doesn't actually really call to me because the images here are so good. I don't know if it uses the images by Steve Pyke. And of course, in many ways, I prefer a book. But the beautiful thing about a film is you would be able to incorporate music in a way that you obviously cannot when you are reading a paper book. But music is hugely important throughout the whole entire thing. It's very important. I didn't really know this. It's very important in Ireland. In my mind, it's kind of like the weather is so bad and everybody's inside all the time. And there are lots of like communal like pubs, where everybody's drinking. So it makes a lot of sense to me that you would have a lot of music and that it would be very beautiful and very, very sad in many ways. So these are these sort of motifs, these kinds of themes that run through the entire book. Poverty, alcohol, shame, and music. There are many others, but those are four that really stood out for me. We're going to close by looking at page 173. I mentioned in the beginning, this is where we're going to focus on this idea of a book. Again, it's not a piece of fiction that has a lot to do with books. So when a book is mentioned, it really stuck out, certainly for someone who is a big reader. Importantly, I don't think this is spoiling too much, but there is a person who is in the hospital at one point, and he is visited in this kind of stupor from the drugs that he has just taken by a dead uncle, by an uncle who is no longer living. So the ghost of this uncle starts telling him things in his hospital bed. He starts with the 2 houses on Tularen and moves to sweep across the townland. He tells me the colors of the doors the day he left. He tells me what fields had the finest animals. He tells me about him who could throw heavy stones the furthest, made the best thatch, could ride a horse standing on its back, lift and carry a curragh on his own, shout loudest, sing sweetest, drink deepest, charm women. He told me about her that reared children and could run fast, had the loveliest hair, moved with the lightest step, said words in French, argued with the priest, remembered the generations, made the sweetest butter. It's just such gorgeous prose. This is actually a perfect example of this kind of Irish syntax with that different use of pronouns from what you would have in English, but also this kind of accumulation of these fragments that really evoke this beautiful vision. And then we have this. I read a book once, he says. This is the ghost uncle speaking. I read a book once, he says. I read many one time. The thing about a book is that the man who is writing it brings all the lives from all the different places and makes them flow together in the same stream. As they move down towards the end, it's like they have loops and holes and shapes that all fit together just nicely, so that they're just one big piece, really. You can look back and see how all of them got where they are. That's the time the writer brings the book to an end, and there's no seeing past it. I'd like to meet the man who wrote a book like that so I could ask him where he got those lives. I never met anything like that in all my lifetime. I look back and I see a big field full of mud, people and animals sliding and me sliding with them. There's no end. There's just times when some are standing and some are fallen. It's so beautiful. He then actually goes on to talk about music, which is very appropriate and very powerful. But this idea of this uncle as having read a book where all of these different lives are all braided together so beautifully is, of course, a comment on exactly the book that the reader is holding in her hands. And then I loved the fact that for the uncle who is dead and who is trying, in ways that are actually strikingly similar to this man who is in exile in the hospital, this emigre, when he is imagining them, it's this kind of muddied, mix of all the people and the animals, and it's not clear to him. So it speaks to the way that the process of this book and the process of all of these different people telling their stories, presumably to Timothy O'Grady, who then wove all these lives together. It's just the absolute miracle of literature. I was so moved when I got to this part Because in some ways it does acknowledge that, and it's very clear about the fact that this is a story that is told from the point of view of this one person, but it is absolutely a weaving together of all of these lives, of all of the people who've experienced this really, really difficult life, which is the life of someone who has had to emigrate from their country. I just found it so beautiful. So I'm going to leave it there. If you haven't read the book, I hope this makes your experience of it a little bit richer. If you have, I hope it also makes your experience of the book richer. It is such a gorgeous piece of prose and really a unique reading experience that I absolutely loved. So thank you very much for tuning in. Happy reading.